In today's episode, I'm going to start tearing into the back of the X5. We're going to cut a whole bunch of stuff so we can fit these giant Bilstein shocks, huge 40-inch Mickey Thompsons, and the Super Duty rear axle. So before I can dive into doing any of this rear suspension, I need to start stripping everything out of it to get a clean starting base. That's the suspension, the fuel tank. I want to pull the interior so I don't ruin it, and then we can start our modifications.
So for the rear suspension, we're going with what is called a 3-link, because there's 3 main links that control where the axle is located under the vehicle, and then an additional panhard bar for left and right. So we have 2 lowers that are going to go back, and then 1 upper.
First, we're going to do a quick overview of the rear suspension. This is the model I've got going for the whole thing, but we're going to just focus on the back. You can see these are my link mount brackets. There's a bunch of layers to the scan data, so there's some other stuff showing, but I made this whole big link assembly here, or link mount assembly. So that'll come in, sandwich both sides of the unibody and weld to it and really disperse that force throughout, I don't know, 2.5 feet of unibody rail. Because I don't want to be able to, like, the link mount has to hang down a bit. It's going to bump into stuff. Rock crawling, you basically drag the bottom across everything here or there. So I don't want to damage those mounts easily. So if I tie into a large section of unibody, it's going to give it a whole bunch of stiffness. It's not going to move its place, change alignment, or do other bad things. Same with this upper link mount. The amount of force there and the way the body is designed, I tried to really spread that out and make it a nice rugged mount. Not going to move around. The tank is super cozy to this upper link, so that's why that's a bent piece, so I can get around the bottom of the fuel tank there. You can see everything in this model at the moment is at full bump. I have a bunch of configurations for ride height and for full droop, just so I know where everything is placed and that it's not going to smash into each other. I did flex it too, but tire is going to get into the inner part of the wheel well here, so we're going to have to cut that. We're going to have to cut the whole arch longer and taller, cut the bumper quite a bit. I moved the wheelbase back because I didn't want to cut it into the door too much or have to move any of that stuff. That's a lot harder to cut than backwards. So the wheelbase is getting longer, both front and rear, so that way I can gain space for the 40s. To keep it low, everything tucks up a lot. So I spent a lot of time trying to sort out what was as low as I can get this thing at full bump, so that I can get the most travel without raising the center of gravity. I don't want the weight up really high, I want it to perform well, so as low as I can keep it on this big of a tire without having to reconfigure the whole thing. And that turned out to be about here. So the diff's, you know, poking through the floor just a whisker here. This upper link mount is gonna come through the floor, so I'm gonna have to cut out here and box this back in. You can see the track bar is bent to finagle itself around some of the floor as well. Everything's very cozy. I played with the geometry quite a bit. It's hard to know your constraints until you start playing with, you know, spreadsheets on what the geometry is going to be and then what you can actually package, and you kind of have to bounce back and forth until you come up with a solution that works and fits your targets as far as, you know, your goals with the vehicle, and then what you can actually package. It's always a compromise, in my opinion, and what I am currently know enough about. I think this will be a great compromise. We'll see when we actually drive it, but on paper it should be pretty good right out of the box. All right, so this is the spreadsheet I used to design all the suspension geometry for the X5 build. I have all of my constraints in CAD. I know where my packaging constraints are and where I can physically put the different suspension mounting locations. I'm inputting these into this wild, awesome spreadsheet that you can download, and it will output all of your different parameters, whether it's anti-squat, roll, all the different things. It'll give you all of those outputs throughout travel and all of the different ways it affects the vehicle. It's intense. There's tons and tons of stuff to it. This spreadsheet is insane. Like, it gives you all sorts of different curves. It'll give you input on how your shocks are affecting things, where your drive shafts are affected, how strong your links are. This is insane. Like, the amount of effort that people have put into the spreadsheet. That's free to download. You can find it on forums. Maybe we'll throw a link to it if you want to start playing with it. Wildly useful because you can start wrapping your head around what geometry changes do what to the vehicle without having to actually try anything yet. So that's what I used to wrap my head around what I was changing and what changes I need to get this to handle the way I want it to. So I spent quite a bit of time dialing this in with what I could physically fit and how I wanted the geometry to work. So it should be pretty gnarly.
Obviously, the unibody doesn't have any of those points, and I'm concerned about its strength. So I've made these large brackets that were all laser cut. I've welded them all together off the car, and this one, as you can see, is fitted, but it braces this whole area and then gives me a solid link mount here. So I have two others, obviously one to go on the other side here, and then one to go in the middle for the upper link. You may have noticed I've removed all the rubber undercoating stuff, which is miserable, but very important because that stuff catches fire pretty easily if you try to weld anywhere near it. So I've done the painful task of wire wheeling all that off, and most of these areas are pretty well prepped. I'm gonna just tack things on so we can cycle things and make sure we're good to go. So my data was with all the sound deadening, everything like that. It's never gonna fit perfect, but you see this little gap here? We had the same issue on the other side. I can tap this up first, I'll tack it, then I'll walk the front back in, and that'll suck it all up tight. This bottom of this unibody has a very slight arc to it, and my part's flat, so it'll fit. Just gonna finagle it a little. Now I'm gonna tack this side, and then this bracket will stay. Nice. I'm gonna have to weld it for an eternity later. But for now, it'll be good enough to cycle everything and make sure things fit the way we want. That's an important thing. If you're gonna be tacking a bunch of brackets and stuff, you should try to tack them in a place where you can cut the tack easily. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But if you have to move something, it will really make your life easier. All right, in order to keep this as low as possible, full bump or full compression means the diff and this upper link mount have to go through the floor here. So I have to cut a bunch of this out. Now I'm gonna kind of trim, not everything, I don't wanna cut the whole floor out in one shot. So I'm gonna take where the link mounts, I'm gonna kind of I like using hole saws because then the edge isn't a dagger, but I can make a nice round corner. I'll probably just pick a couple spots around it, make sure this will clear, and then I can actually cycle the whole car, figure out what else I need to trim, and then later we'll make a patch panel once I know everything clears for good. So first up, I'm just gonna mark a couple spots, figure out where I wanna cut, and make this fit. Now we have a big hole, one of many. It needs to come forward, just a whisker. Ooh.
There we go.
Let me get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
Not easy. Okay. Where'd my tape measure go? Oh no. So this will be drooped out. Which you'll only see off like big jumps and stuff, but
Yeah.
nope.
What do you think?
Should be all right. We're close. This side can compress more and the other side can droop more, but or might not actually be able to droop this far. It'll be close to this. All right, so as you may have imagined, fitting a shock this big in the back of an X5 means you're gonna have to change quite a bit. I have quite an elaborate solution with a lot of laser cut parts, all because I need those shocks to fit and I want that whole area to be incredibly strong, stronger than it was before, and it was already pretty good. So a lot of that already had the mounting provision for the stock rear shock and the stock airbag or air spring or coil spring. So that region of the car is already pretty stiff, but we're cutting a bunch of stuff out and I have a ton of laser cut parts to make it all reinforced and fit enormous shocks. So this is the top portion of the shock mount. I have it already welded together. See, it's a bunch of different pieces because I have a coilover mount and a bypass mount. So this is where the shocks will actually mount to. This hole is where my seatbelt mount is actually going to be. It's the top portion of the shock mount. Everything's keyed and tabbed together. So this is the inner wall of the shock mount. This is how it fits. Keys in nice, like so. A little hammer persuasion. But on top of that, we have these tubes, so I have access to the bolts that'll go through. And I have these plates that'll slip over them, like so, to box in that area. Same with this side, which will box in this whole back part, and this is where the back of the seat, rear seat goes. After that, there's a bunch of inner plates that get put into place to box in the inner side of the wheel well. That'll give us areas to mount our bump stops, so that'll reinforce that whole area, and then box in the sides back into the factory sheet metal. So I have this side tacked in, semi-welded in at the moment. I've got to fit a couple more brackets and pieces in. I wanted to kind of lay out that there is a plan, everything's laser cut. It should work. I made it fit geometry-wise. It doesn't necessarily look the coolest, but it's inside the back of the car, and realistically you don't see that. So, I have a bunch of cutting and welding to do to get all this to fit. So I have to bounce around a little bit. We have the shock mount welded in on this side. That meant I could mount up the track bar, and that's the last thing to locate the axle. But I need to be able to cycle the suspension completely to make sure I have clearance for everything. Right now, this should cycle another 2.5 inches higher than this arch. So I'm gonna start prepping this area and cut out this part of the quarter so I can make space. I'm not gonna put it back on just yet, but I'm gonna try to leave myself some areas to figure out where to cut, where I can put it back. I just basically have to stretch this arch and move it up. So putting some thought into that, I've found if I actually sand it now while it's still one piece, it leaves me a better edge than if I were to try to like remove the paint when I cut it. So if I have a cut edge and I'm trying to remove paint up to that edge, so I want to weld the panel back together, I found it's really easy to make that edge too thin in that area, and it's harder to weld. So if I sand it now while it's a full panel, and then I can mark and make all my cuts, it's a little easier to work with. So I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to remove some paint in the areas I think I'm going to cut. I'm going to drill a bunch of spot welds, pull this off, and then we're going to work on trying to get this tire to cycle to full compression. And then we're going to have to do the same thing on the other side and continue on. All right, so I have the other side shock mount in. I've cut out the other arch, and the vehicle is at full bump on the shock shaft bump stops right now. So I wanted to make sure that was even, everything's centered and where it wants to be, and then I can set the height of the hydraulic bump stops. So these are the large, see if I can do it without dropping it, hydraulic bump stops. I've let all the nitrogen out of this one, so it's at full compression. So I'm going to figure out where this works out. I have my brackets that are supposed to key and tab in, but I still have a little freedom to set my ride height. So I'm going to play with that, make sure it's set evenly left to right, tack these in, and from there, all of our hard mounting points are figured out. So it's on the bump stops on these shocks here, but those can still compress a little bit. So I want all the high-speed events to be taken up with this bump stop and not get into the shock. But in a flex scenario, the shock can take over because it's going to work the axle away from this bump stop. So the next step is setting the arch height because I want it to fit and look decent. I want a little bit of clearance, but I want it to be pretty close at bump because I think that looks pretty good. But in a flex scenario, the tire is going to get a little closer. So I kind of have to pick a happy medium ground of where that's going to be. It's unlikely it's going to be super flexed out all the time at a high-speed event, so it shouldn't get into the arch really hard. I think I'm going to try to make sure the arch is a nice smooth surface so that it can't grab the tire or anything, but if it were to rub a little bit super flexed out, it's not the end of the world. But we'll have plenty of clearance for a nice high-speed bump and a little bit of off-camber situation. Just the extreme ones might get a little close. But, yeah. Feels pretty good to have most of the hard points figured out, and we can start cycling some stuff and work out the details. All right, so I've Frankensteined a bunch of pieces of the stock car, and then I made this piece in between to make an arch that's bigger and higher. So this is pretty close to fitting. I'm gonna finagle it a little bit more. I'm TIG welding everything here, and the reason you do that, because we had a bunch of comments when I did the wide body on the Mark III, you TIG weld instead of MIG weld because it's more uniform heat and you wind up with a much softer weld. So I can run it over the planishing hammer, which is over there, and that's how I got this. This is just, one of my welds just ran over the planishing hammer, smooth it right out. It's much softer, easier to work with. It's not gonna crack along the edges. And it's less prone to warping, so you're not adding too much material and too much heat. This is a nice uniform heat, and I can control how much filler I'm adding. So that's why I'm TIGging everything, and I'm gonna TIG it all onto the car. But we're close. I should spend a little more time, honestly, getting it to fit a little nicer before I weld it, but I'm getting impatient. And for what this thing's doing, I'm not looking for a concourse winner here. I want it to look like an X5, so it should be easy enough. All right, so pretty much all the sheet metal work is done back here. My main goal is to try to wrap up all the holes and little areas that we had to address, and then kind of figure out some of the other oddities, like this fuel filler tube. because I put a bunch of suspension where that used to go through the wheel well. So I did a little hard pipe down and through, so that'll get us over near the tank. Keep it clear of the tire, so I don't want to be grabbing any of that with tires or rocks or anything. I plugged up some of the little holes that were in the sides. This hole I had to cut for tire space and then massage all this around. And then we've got the little bump up here for where the upper link comes through. So this is pretty much wrapped up. I have to like mount some seat tabs and a couple little odds and ends and get that wrapped up and painted, but the hard work is done. A lot of the welds aren't super pretty because E-coated multi-layered steel unibody stuff has like, you know, it was dipped all as one thing, so there's layers of paint and E-coat in between where they spot weld everything together, and it's just not a good time to weld. But it's stuck together, it's not going anywhere. It's just not as pretty as I wanted. All right, so I'm just gonna quickly recap all the hard parts I have done here. Most of the finished work is done for all that. There's gonna be some detail work like brake lines and limit straps and that type of thing we're gonna figure out later once we're dealing with the same thing in the front. Just get in the zone and get it all over with. Well, for now, this is all the mounts. You know, we've got our bump stop mounts, coilovers up here, the triple bypass in the back on each side. We did a 3-link setup back here with a pan hard bar. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to try to keep the stock tank because it's a pretty large capacity for the space it takes up. I could have done triangulated 4-link and made a new tank, but at the time this seemed easier. Let's see how it works. That's why this upper link has this bend in it though, is so at full bump, it's like just about touching this tank strap here. And that all fits as it's supposed to. I shot for like 55 to 60% anti-squat with this rear setup, and it's pretty similar up front. From my understanding and kind of the balance I'm shooting for on this, that should be a pretty good range. Should be decent grip, decent climbability, but also should absorb bumps pretty well at speed. I put a bunch of effort into the geometry to try to make all that work well. Everything lays out the way I intended, so pretty happy with it overall. All right, so that wraps up most of the big deals in the back. We're gonna move up front. So next up, suspension, engine trans, all that type of thing. Make sure you like and subscribe, and you can follow me at Mike the Day. And we'll see you guys next week.